My name is still Lara Parson. I am still an assistant professor, and I have recently been promoted to associate professor official on August 15th, which I'm very excited about, but I believe I don't get to introduce myself as such for another few months. So we're going to talk about empathy today. And I think it might be useful even before we move to the land acknowledgement, even if you've already seen it a little bit, we're going to revisit it, to talk a little bit about my path to talking about empathy and why we're here talking about empathy today. So my role is, again, assistant professor for now in educational and organizational leadership. And what I designed early on in my career is a new model of competency-based curriculum design. And so the goal of that project was to start from knowledges, plural. So not just focusing on general knowledge in higher education, but starting from a place that acknowledged and validated the multiple knowledges that are often present in our communities and on our campuses. And so as a part of that, the Air Force brought me in to use that model to design or identify the competencies of an ethical leader. And to do that, to talk about the competencies of an ethical leader and then design curriculum as it was associated. And so to identify those competencies, part of that data collection process was to talk to over 6,000 airmen across the Air Force. And then we also went to the literature, talked to faculty, talked to leaders. And one of the themes that emerged throughout that process was the idea of perspective taking. And so over and over, we heard people saying, a leader, a good leader, is able to take the perspective of those that they're leading. Perspective taking was something that I taught for a long time. But as I dug into the literature and started to develop an understanding really more conceptually of what perspective taking was, I realized that really what we were talking about was empathy. And empathy, as we often hear about it or have heard about it maybe, and I think that's shifting, we'll find out. We often think about and talk about empathy maybe as something that involves kind of sharing emotions or talking about your emotions, which can be a part of empathy. But when we really think about what empathy composes two really core parts. One is being able to feel with someone else. So identifying someone else's emotions and then feeling a similar emotion in yourself. The second aspect of empathy, and I might argue the part of empathy that's often missing from the conversation, is this idea of perspective taking, being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand the situation from their perspective. And so put those two together, and they're often in the literature, they're talked about as two separate things, but I think you can imagine that you really can't have one without the other. You can't know that you're sharing the emotions of someone else without being able to put yourself in their shoes. But to really understand and see the world and experience with them, you have to share in their emotions. So contrary maybe to the way that we often think about or talk about empathy, empathy doesn't mean that we're going to sit down and maybe talk about our emotions with someone, although it could, right? There's nothing wrong with that. But empathy, when we're really talking about what empathy is about our ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes, to see a situation from their perspective as well as our own, and then feel with them, to feel a similar emotion. And we'll get into the nuances of that a little bit. But the key element here too is even though we're doing all of that, we don't lose ourselves. We don't recognize that we're seeing the world from their perspective, but it's not ours, right? That we might be feeling with them or feeling similar emotions, but that's their emotion and not ours. And that ability to preserve that self-other distinction is really what helps us to avoid burnout when we're talking about empathy. So kind of a quick overview to empathy. We'll go over those in more detail in a second, but that really relates to our next slide. And our next slide is our land acknowledgement. Have we done the land acknowledgement already? We have not. Okay, well, I'm glad. So we'll pause here for a second, and I would like everyone to read it in silence. All right. So it's important for us to always include a land acknowledgement, but if we don't connect the land acknowledgement to what we're talking about that day, we run the risk of it just becoming another box that we've checked. And so when we think about a land acknowledgement, and the reason that I talked about empathy a little bit before we went into the land acknowledgement is empathy and perspective taking provides two opportunities for us when we see a land acknowledgement. The first is to think about the perspective of those whose lands that we are on, the traditional lands, and our perspective, how might they feel? What might their perspective be? What might it be their perspective as we think about reading a land acknowledgement? This also provides an opportunity for us to think about Indigenous students in our classrooms. If we have a land acknowledgement on our syllabus, how might it feel to them? How might they feel to see that land acknowledgement on the syllabus? That can impact how we talk about it, right? Do we talk about it every day? Do we put it on the syllabus and not include it in our first day of class? And I'm not here to tell you what to do or what the right way to do it is, but I think empathy and perspective taking allows us to take a land acknowledgement, to think about what it means and what it might mean, not from our perspective, but from someone else's perspective. And then also to think about it, what it means when we say it in a space like this, or if we include it on our syllabus, or if we talk about it in that first day of class. So thinking about how we address that, not from our perspective and including it in that way, but thinking about the perspective of those that are hearing it and what that might mean. And so as we do that today, I hope we can think about that and approach this session in that manner as well. So here's our outline of our presentation today. So we're going to dive back into what is empathy. We're going to talk specifically about what teacher empathy is and what that means. We'll talk a bit more about empathy in teaching. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some cautions. And then finally, we'll dive into the real content of this speech, which is teaching empathy through an ethic of care. And we'll talk about those 4 components. So one of the things I want to highlight, though, and one of my challenges as I thought about developing this speech today is recognizing that we couldn't do all the things. So we're not going to walk out of this room and be like, cool, I got empathy, right? Like, check. I know exactly how I'm going to approach this. This, I hope, will leave you with some ideas. This, I hope, will leave you with a path that you can go to start to think about what that means. But what empathy means to me and what behaving with empathy means to me and what that looks like isn't the same as what it is for you, because there's not like, although the internet might say differently, there's not like a list of things that you can say that are like, I'm empathetic, right? Those are not empathetic responses. What that means, what it means for you to pay attention to your students, what it means to act with responsibility or to accept responsibility to support them, what it means to actually do that and the way that you navigate that, what you say, what your emails say, what your syllabus says, that's personal and that's up to you. I'm going to provide some suggestions or some way that the literature has suggested that we can do that, but I'm not going to give you answers. Instead, we're going to talk about what these things mean so you can start to think about how that might apply in your own setting. And so hopefully I'll give you a place to start, a path, or maybe some motivation to do that thing, but I won't tell you exactly how to do it. In fact, empathy, even though I talk about it every day and I think about it every day, is still something that is developing for me. It's still something that I mess up every day, right? There's still a moment where I'm like, whoa, I could have reacted better there, right? Or, whew, if I had just paused and thought about their perspective, maybe I wouldn't have sent that email. So it's something I'm navigating as we go. And so I hope we can just accept a responsibility to navigate that, but know that it's going to require ongoing effort. So to start, though, let's talk about empathy. And as I mentioned, scholars will often break it down into 2 component parts. Some say 3, and that's affective empathy, which is maybe what we think about when we talk about what empathy is in general. So that's paying attention to another's emotions, identifying them, and feeling similar. So that feeling with someone else. Brene Brown has a great video on the difference between empathy and sympathy. I recommend that you watch it. It's only about 5 minutes long. But the idea that empathy is different than looking down and saying, I'm so sorry for you. I'm so sorry you're going through that. Oof, that sounds rough. But saying, right, being there with them, being there in that situation, feeling a similar emotion without losing yourself in their emotion. So recognizing that it's still there. The second element, again, is that perspective taking, and that's seeing the world from the perspective of someone else from their perspective or from their position. And so I often think, and this is why I have the picture of the elephant here, if you've heard the story of maybe 4 individuals on 4 sides of an elephant, and the person to the, let's say, the front right of the elephant is asked to describe the elephant. And they're like, yeah, well, it has, big floppy ears, a long trunk, I'm not real sure if elephants have quad muscles, but in this case they do. The front of their leg, strong, built. The person at the back of the elephant is like, cool, you've described something. It's not an elephant. Let me tell you what an elephant looks like. And they describe maybe a long tail, some powerful back leg muscles, and that goes around, right? Where every person is talking about what they're seeing. And so, what empathy requires, what perspective taking requires, is that you recognize that to understand what that elephant looks like, you have to hear from every person, every corner of that elephant. You also have to accept that that person at the back of the elephant, what they're saying, what they're describing, that's true. That's what they're seeing. That's their truth. That doesn't invalidate your own, but you have to accept that what they're saying, what they're talking about is their valid experience, their valid conversation. And then again, that doesn't mean you disregard your own experience, because it's without your own perspective, you're not going to get a good picture of what that elephant looks like. Right. And so if we think about what perspective taking is, it's how we understand and accept our perspective, and then accept that there are other equally valid perspectives of a situation, and that perhaps hearing all of them is the way that we gain an understanding of that situation. So specifically, when we think about teacher empathy, I appreciate this quote from Myers et al. 2019, and please feel free to reach out for a list of what I would call reading resources. But teacher empathy is the degree to which instructors work to deeply understand students' personal and social situations, feel caring and concern in response to students' positive and negative emotions, and communicate their understanding and caring to students through their behavior. I feel sometimes like empathy in teaching is a special situation, and often I think sometimes misunderstood. So being empathetic with someone, especially being empathetic with a student, and I'm going to go to an extreme example here, but let's say a student comes in and they are asking for you to just completely eliminate an assignment. If they're saying, hey, I've been through a really hard time, can you please just waive this assignment? This is extreme, right? I don't know that this is something that we encounter on a daily basis. Being empathetic with that student when we're thinking about teacher empathy doesn't mean that we hear their story of how challenging things have been, see from their perspective, and say, yeah, definitely, we should get rid of that assignment. Teacher empathy listens from that perspective and says, okay, I still have a responsibility to myself. I have a responsibility to this institution. I have a responsibility to the other students in this class, and I have a responsibility to you to make sure that you've learned this material. However, comma, how you demonstrate that you've learned that material might be different, right? So the question when we're talking about teacher empathy is not listening from their perspective and just doing what you think they want, right? Or what you think they're asking for, but it's thinking, how can I ensure that I'm meeting my instructional and my educational goals while acknowledging that you have had a challenging experience, right? Sometimes I think sometimes we get so caught up in fairness, we get so caught up in everyone doing the exact same thing, we forget that maybe our objective is actually that students have learned the things that they're supposed to learn in this class. And so the question of empathy might be, in some cases, in this kind of extreme example that I gave, how can the student demonstrate? How can they meet those learning objectives? Right? How can they still do that? And how can I provide opportunities to do that? Or how can I have already built those opportunities into my syllabus in a way that they can demonstrate that they've learned that material, right? It acknowledges, it hears that maybe this isn't the right way to do it. And I'm making a suggestion here, but maybe isn't the exact thing that I've put on my syllabus, right? So empathy doesn't mean that you say, yeah, cool, assignment done. It's been a tough go. Let's go from here. Empathy might say, I'm sorry, you've had that experience, feeling with them, and then saying, how can we work together so that you can demonstrate that you've met these learning objectives? What does that look like? So teacher empathy takes that a little bit further. And I would say all empathy does that. Perspective taking doesn't mean that you accept someone else's perspective. It says you take into account, you accept that it's valid, and then you make a decision accordingly without losing yourself. So when we think about what empathy means, you're simply taking all of this extra information into account to make a decision, an instructional decision that's grounded in care and respect. So if we look briefly at the research between empathy and effective teaching, we can see kind of across the literature that empathy predicts positive student outcomes. And that includes the following. We know that teacher empathy has a positive impact on learning, on student persistence, both through a course, but also to graduation. Empathy has a positive relationship to student engagement in the classroom. It's related to better self-regulation for students. And engagement is so important that I put it on there twice. And also post-graduation readiness, but engagement, big deal. Yeah. So if we're thinking about what the literature says, we know that these are the things that we really want to see from students, and the idea of empathy. And so empathetic behaviors from an instructor has a positive impact on the experiences of students in our classroom. All of these things are related to learning, but not just learning content, right? The things that we want to get out of higher education, where they're coming out with all of the skills that they need, hopefully to have met kind of our institutional goals and achieve their own personal and professional goals. So a few things that I want to talk about that I'm going to call cautions, but are some things to think about when we talk about what empathy is. The first is that research has found that without even thinking about it, we are more likely to be empathetic with those that we perceive to be like us, and we're less likely to be empathetic with those that we perceive to be not like us. And this isn't often an intentional decision. It's just an unconscious situation that happens. And so one of the things, in fact, if I could say the one thing that I hope that we take away from this presentation is the ability to pause. So I hope that empathy, and one of the key skills that is related to the development of empathy is developing mindfulness skills, mindfulness and meditation. But if we can find that moment to pause, if we can pause before that's the email that we want to respond to right away, we feel like we must respond. If we can pause when we recognize a student is asking us something, and maybe our instinct is to say no, or to get frustrated, or to feel that I need to buy the it's in the syllabus t-shirt, right? Like, what is our ability to pause and to say, why, what's happening here, right? Ask that question. And sometimes that question might be, if a different student was asking me this, would my reaction be the same? And that can go both ways, right? But recognizing that in the moment, we are more likely to be empathetic with those that we perceive to be like us in some sort of way, and less likely to be empathetic with those that we perceive to be different. The second, and this I think is important for us to recognize, if we look at student evaluations of teaching, often women and persons of color are more penalized when they're not empathetic, and so it's expected. And so often the need to be empathetic, and again, I think this has a lot to do often with what our perception of what empathy is, the idea that empathy is something that is really related to emotions and sort of caring behaviors, which can absolutely be someone's expression of empathy, but it's not the only way to do it. But we know that especially when it comes to gender, women are expected more to be perceived as empathetic, and they're penalized more in student evaluations of teaching if they're not. And so I think that's always something to talk about. I also think that's also something that's okay to talk about with your class, right? Like, have those conversations, be open upfront, talk about what student evaluations mean, why they're important, but maybe what happens in that process. This I think is key too. And this is that ability to pause before you respond, but stress and fear make empathy more difficult. So if you're rushed in the hall, and a student stops you and they want to have a conversation about your class, and you're like, oh, I want to do this, but I got to go somewhere, right? Pausing, being able to say, this is really important. I can tell you really want to talk about this. Can we set up a time so that this is dedicated so we can have these conversations? Recognizing in yourself when you are best able to have those conversations. So one of the things that I know, and this is not ideal, but I know that at the end of teaching a 3-hour class is not the best time for me to then have another meeting with a student. And so I make that clear to students on day one. I say, I am not going to be best fit to have a long conversation with you after 3 hours of teaching. I'm hungry. But also I've sort of given you everything that I have. So unless it's urgent, if it's okay that we just schedule a meeting for the next day, because I know that in that moment, I'm not going to be prone to empathy. I'm going to be prone to like, how can we quickly move this on because I am very hungry or whatever, tired. So recognizing those moments. We also know in situations where you don't feel safe, right? It's hard to be empathetic because you're not able to, what Daniel Siegel calls attune to others. If you're not feeling safe, you can't sort of tune in on what others are feeling. Burnout. So if you're feeling like you have to be empathetic all the time, or you're being empathetic all the time, that can lead to burnout. Often, though, in the literature, that's also related to not maintaining a self-other distinction. So recognizing you're feeling with someone else, but you're not recognizing that those are not your own feelings. And so having strong emotions, and that can happen with even when trying to maintain that self-other distinction, but that can lead to burnout. And one of the analogies I like is the idea of empathy as a flashlight. And so you can point your empathy flashlight at someone or a group of individuals and focus on feeling with them, understanding their perspectives. But then you can turn that flashlight off, or you can point it in another direction. But also an empathy flashlight, and maybe not like newfangled LED flashlights, but the battery powered flashlight, like eventually those batteries need to be recharged. And so recognizing that empathy flashlight will go on and off, but eventually you're going to have to recharge those batteries. And then also recognizing that there's a level of sort of directionality that you can move and shift. This one I think is really important. It's important, and I call it a scope of practice. But there are things that we are qualified as instructors to help students with. We can advise them in their classes, and everyone will have slightly different scopes of practice. But we are not counselors, right? We have many offices on campus that are designed to help and support students. And so being empathetic doesn't mean that we shouldn't take the role of a counselor or a psychologist, or even if we don't do financial aid, right? All of those things are outside our scope of support. And so where empathy comes in there, when we talk about the framework, is empathy means that we know what our scope is, what we're qualified for, and that we have a list of resources that we can walk students to or bring students to provide those other areas of support. So empathy, paying attention to a student, listening to what they need, doesn't mean that you play these other roles. It means instead that you're listening to them and that you're able to refer them or guide them to the right resources when it's outside your own scope of practice. And then finally, remembering too, and this has to do with perspective taking. Part of perspective taking is not just understanding, or part of understanding the perspective of those in the room, an individual in front of you, or a more generalized other, is understanding the history and context of, say, their background. But there's a lot of power between an instructor and a student, and it's not our students' jobs to be our cultural informants, right? And so if we have questions about the experiences of a group of people who share an identity, we can't ask our students to be those cultural informants. There's a power relationship there where they might not feel comfortable doing that. They might not feel safe. They might not feel safe telling you their valid experiences. And that puts them in a really bad situation. And so if we need to learn about a culture, about an identity group, about the experiences of a group of people, we need to go outside of our students and not put students in the position of being our cultural informants. So we'll pause here for a second because I knew I would need a drink. But also because you have a long day of sort of teaching and learning to do. And so before we dive into the way to approach empathy, what I'd like everyone to do is to just think about the classes you taught recently, or maybe your teaching experience the last semester. And let's take a few minutes. And I'd like you to start and jot down, if you have notebooks, what are some things that you liked about how the class went? And what are some things that you wish had gone differently? So when we're teaching through an ethic of care, and one of the things I forgot to mention at the beginning is there will be time for questions and discussion at the end. So if you have questions, please hold them or put them in the chat. So if we think about teaching through an ethic of care, we see that as being framed through four main, I would say, approaches or ways to think and plan for teaching with empathy. And like most things in teaching, we have to have some sort of plan, right? We have to have some sort of preparation, and empathy, or teaching with empathy, is similar. So if we think about teaching through an ethic of care, we're talking about paying attention, accepting responsibility to act, preparing to respond, and then actually responding. So there's a lot of work that goes into this process before you actually make a response. And one of the things that I always think is interesting, and as I mentioned before, and this isn't what the topic of this presentation, but there's so much about empathy and empathetic responses that share a lot of commonalities with mindfulness and mindful responses. And so I would say, and the literature is clear about that too, that one way to develop empathy, or one way to develop or hone your empathetic skills and responses, is to develop a regular mindfulness practice. But today we're talking about teaching. So the first one is thinking about paying attention. And so paying attention is simply that: understanding who's in our room, paying attention and learning about their backgrounds, why they're taking this class. So the things that are informing their experiences in this class, and then paying attention to what's happening across the semester, right? Understanding, listening, trying to figure out how they're learning, if they're learning, and what's happening in that process. And so some examples of things that we can do to pay attention would be to learn about students' individual and socio-historical cultural context. And you might wonder, how do you know, right, coming in? But there's always a role to do some of those entry, tell us about yourself, introductions, even before you come into class, right? That could be a quiz. That could be something that they share in introduction. And then that requires research on our own part, right? Not relying on students to be our cultural informants. But once we find out why they're here, or what background experiences are informing their experience in our classroom, that's our opportunity to learn a bit about that, right? And that can happen maybe that first week of class, or before students have even come in. Ask for student feedback on your teaching, and do that across the semester. So one of my favorite tools is Brookfield's Critical Incidence Questionnaire. Brookfield's Critical Incidence Questionnaire is just 5 questions that says, in essence, and you can use it once a week or every class period if you only meet once a class period, but basically just ask students what went well, maybe what didn't go so well, what surprised you. I'm paraphrasing here. Maybe what surprised you, what confused you, or what did you find confusing in this classroom? Completely open-ended. You can deliver it via Qualtrics and make it completely anonymous. In fact, I would suggest that anonymity is the most important aspect of this. In fact, and there are people in the room that have taken a class from me, I will stop doing the critical incidence questionnaire if I feel like I know who's making certain responses, just because I don't want it to impact how I'm perceiving those students. But asking for their sort of gauge on what's going on in the classroom. That's a part of paying attention, understanding what people are experiencing in your classroom. The other thing that I think is important, though, too, that I haven't done as much until recently, is asking students to provide or to reflect on their own learning, their own experience in the classroom. So not just how am I doing? How is the teaching going? How is the class going? What's happening? But also, how do you feel you're learning, right? And if students are feeling confident, or if they're feeling like, man, this is really hard, I'm not smart enough, I'm not feeling like I can do this class, this is really hard, that's important feedback for us too, right? Because we don't want to create classroom situations where students feel like they don't have a possibility of succeeding, right? We want it to be, if we think about scaffolding our class, right, within that zone of proximal development, we want to ensure that students feel like it's challenging but achievable, not challenging and therefore impossible, right? And so getting an understanding of where they think they are in the process, how they're learning, can be an important way for us to develop that understanding. Another key thing I think is important about paying attention is to identify who benefits from your course, and not just the students that are in the room. So if you're preparing for a certain career, what does that mean, right? Where are they going? And I don't just mean the employers, although understanding the employer's perspective can be important too, but who does that profession serve? What does that mean? What does that look like? And how does that inform, or thinking from that perspective, how does that maybe inform or change what you might be teaching? Or how does that inform or change what sort of examples or content or context you're including in your classroom, right? Thinking not just about who's in the room, but who they might serve in the future, or what communities they might work in, might also impact the type of content that we're including in our classroom. So the second element of teaching through an ethic of care is accepting responsibility to act. And this requires ongoing effort across the semester. And I think this is important because you can pay attention and notice, but do nothing about it, right? And so I think we have to reach a point where we say, like, I'm going to learn some things and I'm going to do some things about that. So if I learn, if I see, if I observe these things, if I observe that content's not working for them, if I'm using a method that isn't working for students, if I find out that I have not, say, decentered my syllabus, if I have not done these things, I'm going to take action and make changes, right? And so that's why I think this is such a key component of an ethic of care, is being able to pause and say, this is important. I'm going to have to make some changes, and I'm going to have to pay attention throughout the semester. And so some ways that we can do that at the beginning in preparation is to identify your positionality, right? What is your position in the classroom? How is power and privilege implicated in the decisions, the instructional decisions that you make, how you are in the classroom? I think too, setting clear boundaries, what you, for yourself, when you can meet, how you can make those meets, how you can meet students' needs and have those conversations, but do that in a way that doesn't affect your own holistic health, your own self-care. One thing that I think is important is that we interrogate our attributions of bad behavior, right? And I think I said this earlier, but it's in the syllabus is a key example of that. Often, sometimes we're like, why don't you just read the syllabus? And students are like, yo, it's 21 pages, right? And I'm not saying you shouldn't have a 21-page syllabus. I have no skin in that game. But recognizing too that sometimes it's hard as students to know what to prioritize, what to read, what's relevant, what's important. Maybe I shouldn't have at a teaching and learning conference shouldn't have suggested you don't have a 21-page syllabus. Whatever, just maybe put like headings or like a glossary or something. Right. But recognizing that the student maybe isn't willfully not reading the syllabus. The student just didn't know where it was. Right? Or it was so long, it was easier or better for them or faster, right? Because the assignment is due, and that's okay. That happens. We've given due dates that students are trying to meet it. If we don't want them to work last minute, right? We scaffold in pre-work before we get there. And so that's maybe not the student not reading the syllabus, right? It might be that they don't know what it is, or they didn't know what was relevant, right? Or they didn't know where to find that information. And so pausing before we say students are lazy, if you had just read the syllabus, right? The book list has been there all along, right? These are all things we can say. Instead, can we pause, right? Can we say, oh, did the bookstore not have the book, right? So before we say students are always, right? Or before we say, ugh, it's the student, or students just aren't paying attention, can we ask the question, is there something else going on, right? Is there something else that I could have done to better support, or could I have done something different in this situation? And I always say, like, if you have a test and everyone fails, that's not a failure of your class, right? That's a failure, in my case, of me, right? If I do a class and 70% fail that test, they haven't failed me, I failed them. And so how do we interrogate? How do we flip the switch? Not to always say it's about us too, right? Because that can be a slippery slope as well. But how can we pause and say what else might be happening here, instead of just students being lazy or not performing the way that we think they should? It's a good idea to break projects into smaller parts. And then also to consider redo or retake policies. And again, I'm providing all of this is like a buffet of like cool teaching options that you can provide. That doesn't mean you have to do all of them. So one of the things that I do, and I will say too, I mainly teach graduate students, but I have a sort of revise and resubmit opportunity. So if they have an assignment and they don't like the grade, they can revise and resubmit. For my doctoral students, they have to include a memo, sort of like a response letter that they might write to a journal. So they have to respond to the feedback that I provided, but they can resubmit to get the higher grade that they want until the last day that I accept work in that class. Again, you don't have to do these things, but think about what that means, what that looks like. Another thing that I really like that I just read about and I implemented it like immediately is implementing one like 48-hour free pass where students will just email and be like, hey, I need to use my 48 hours late card. And you say, don't tell me why. You get one per semester where you just say like, I need an extra 48 hours before this assignment is due. And emphasizing, you don't need to tell me why. You don't need to justify it. It's yours. You can take it whenever you want. So how can we build that into our classes? How can we build flexibility in a way that acknowledges that students will have these things happen? And that we don't want them to feel scared or like they're failing, but saying that's just a part of life. Let's build this into our class and process. So I think, and often accepting responsibility to act and then being prepared to respond, I feel like there's a lot of similarities between the two. And I think, though, what I want to emphasize here is there's not a right way to demonstrate empathy. And I said that at the very beginning of this presentation. There's there might be a wrong way, which is not paying attention, right? But there's not, you shouldn't do what I do. I say more about that, so much so that it's like a common like catchphrase around my house, like say more about that, right? But that doesn't mean that that's yours, but that's what I say when I feel like I need to understand more about a situation. So thinking now, developing those questions, being prepared to use them if there's a situation where you need to understand more or you need to know more, that's what you need to do, is figure that out for yourself. You don't need to use mine. Although say more about that is just I'm just kidding. So a few other options is having that list of referral options for students who need support. And I don't know for sure, but I would bet that there's already probably resources like somewhere, and you just need to like collate them into one for yourself so that you can provide students for that. So a list that I have handy is being able to links to the counseling center, links to like the filing a report of sexual harassment or assault, the anti-bias information. And I'm just listing a few of those, but I just have those ready. So I'm not like, oh, like scrambling because I know I need to make that referral. I just have those ready. And so if a student brings a situation to my experience that is far outside my scope of practice, I know that I have those ready. And then a lot of times, one of the things I think that was reinforced in the literature, pretty, it may have been a few years since it was talked about more broadly, but the difference between giving the resource and then asking if they would like us to accompany them to that resource is really big. So if you can demonstrate a willingness not only to provide the resource, but say, if you'd like, I can come with you or I can show you where that office is an important aspect of that. But in order to do that, you have to know that yourself too. Build in flexibility, like I mentioned, the free 48-hour pass. Don't tell me why, just 48 hours. And then I also think it's important to talk about and explain the rationale behind the policies that you have. If you have a no late work policy, and I'm not saying that you should or should not, that's not the purpose here, but explain why, explain what that looks like, explain what that means. And I will say too, as you're explaining that, or as you're preparing to explain the why behind a policy, there also might be times where you're like, well, that why isn't very good, right? And so that might also be an opportunity for you to be like, we're going to change. So I think those are good opportunities too. And then finally, responding. And so in a lot of ways, we've done all the things to set ourselves up to have an empathetic response. But when we're thinking about making the responses, how do we prioritize student learning? How do we ensure that the students in our room are meeting the learning objectives that we set for this class? That's, I hope, our first goal. And recognizing that that might look different for different students. And so if a student comes to us and has had a challenging experience or maybe needs some flexibility, how can we respond in a way that prioritizes their learning, that ensures they meet the learning objectives, and recognizing and accepting that what that looks like or how that looks might be different for everyone. I think a model of teaching that builds that in right from the beginning is called scaffolded autonomy, where that is like you come into a classroom and you have a menu of options, and students pick from that menu of options to decide how they're going to achieve their grade. It's called scaffolded autonomy, and I'd be happy to provide a reference to that as well. That doesn't mean you have to do that, right? But thinking about what are ways that I can ensure that this student or this group of students still meets the learning objectives, acknowledging that it might not look exactly the same as everyone else. Being flexible, building that in, and even starting to think about what that might look like, or asking a student to think about what that might look like, right? So our goal is that you are able to write a paper that could be submitted to an academic journal. How do you feel like, given this situation, given these circumstances, do you have some ideas about how that might work for you, right? And often students will come back, in my experience, with things that are awesome, far beyond what I could have imagined. And in a lot of ways, take on a lot of responsibility for the learning themselves. We've given them a lot of empowerment in that situation when we say, I hear you, that sounds challenging. Here's the learning objective. How do you envision that you can demonstrate that you've met that? Active listening is important. So that's listening without thinking about how you're going to respond, but just paying attention. And then I love this idea of radical empathy. So if you're feeling like you have that moment, maybe with a student that you're having trouble connecting with, or you are having that moment where you want to say, like, it's in the syllabus, following this kind of guideline for practice. Notice, pause, reconnect, reflect. So notice what's happening, paying attention both to your own response, right? But also how the student might be feeling. Pausing, thinking about what that might look like. And then in some ways, maybe making that attempt to connect with a student and then pausing to reflect on how that went. That doesn't mean that it will always work. We always are doing our best in the classroom, but we won't reach and connect with every student in our room. That doesn't mean that we just disregard and give up, right? But acknowledging that sometimes that happens. And in a very large class, there are always going to be a few student evaluations of teaching that aren't positive, right? That doesn't mean that we give up or that we should just say whatever, but recognizing that that's going to happen and we're going to do our best to serve our students to the best of our abilities, to pay attention, to try to meet their needs, but accept that sometimes it won't work. And those are just learning opportunities for us to move forward. So I'll pause here and then we'll move to our discussion and questions, but thinking about your wishes. And so hopefully you wrote down your likes too. But which area of teaching through an ethic of care maybe could change your wish into a like? Or have you identified anything from some of the things that we've talked about today that you can apply in your classroom? And as a reminder, the 4 areas are paying attention, accepting responsibility to act, preparing to respond, and responding. So we'll take a few more minutes for you just to pause, think about your wishes, and think about if there's anything here either that does apply to your wishes or doesn't, that maybe you'd like to try to implement the next time you teach. All right. So I hope you were able to identify some things from this presentation that you might apply, but also like empathy won't solve all your problems, right? Wouldn't that be neat? And so I also included this because I hope that it also provided maybe a bit of a guide for your engagement for the rest of the conference today. Some opportunities. You've created some questions maybe that you might want to have answered. Maybe think about how you can address that. And I hope that was helpful for you to do that now. Like, I hope empathy works, right? It's all I think about. So it should be what everyone thinks about. But I also hope that you have some questions to look for answers for the rest of your conference today. And so with that, I'll open it up for questions or just general discussion. And I'll let Stacy, if there's any in the chat too, I'll let you read those. Yes.
Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. I just want to ask a very conceptual question here. Empathy, where is this framework like being used more commonly now in teaching and learning, or like where does the idea come from?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so it's interesting because a lot of my work prior to really focusing on this presentation and as I started doing it has been in sort of the leadership frame. And so there is a large body of literature on empathy, but it's growing in the leadership framework. And then there's a lot, of course, in sort of thinking about like counseling and that sort of support, but there's not so much with teaching. In fact, when I went through, I think I could only identify 1 or 2 books, which was good. So I'm under contract to write a book on teaching with empathy or empathy in higher education, right? So that was a good thing. But in terms of like thinking about it or what it means in higher education, it's really relatively new. And so a recent chapter that I co-authored with Dr. Kitch, who's of Air University, was thinking it created a framework for teaching empathy through a curriculum of care. And so really, it's been framed largely through an ethic of care approach to teaching, but it really hasn't, to my knowledge, right? It might be there and I just haven't found it yet, which is entirely possible, but there hasn't been a lot of work done creating just a real framework for empathy in higher education. And so what I'm doing is trying to take some of that great literature from counseling, from leadership, and then think about how that looks in higher education. It's a great question. Mm-hmm. And I would say there's more to, but I'm going to say question mark here. So, because my sense is that there's more even in like K-12 education, but we see that in general in the scholarship of teaching and learning. So teaching and learning. So my PhD is in teaching and learning in higher education. And so I co-edited 4 volumes on teaching and learning in higher education to promote social justice in higher education. And the focus largely of the first volume of that set was taking some of those concepts and theories of teaching and learning that are often found in K-12 education and thinking about and reframing those for a higher education setting.
All right. So thinking at a scale a little bit beyond an individual classroom. So the students are taking multiple classes from multiple instructors. Do you think having one teacher who teaches with empathy can offset other teachers who maybe don't teach with as much empathy?
So I might ask us to pause and think about a teacher that had a big impact on us. And I can think about that one teacher, and I didn't have negative experiences, but I know that that one teacher had a significantly positive impact on my ability to stay in a program. And so it always matters, right? And I know that's not what your question was, but I can say, like, having one person that's demonstrating care, someone who is listening, who's paying attention, that provides the support or access to the support can be a reason that a student persists, that a student doesn't say like, oh, okay, science isn't for me, I'll go somewhere else, right? But would it be better if everyone did? Absolutely. But I would say having that one student that matters, or that one teacher, or that one instructor, or that one advisor that's there, that's paying attention, that's listening, that can be there and say, no, what you're experiencing, that's not just part of being a grad student. That's actually not good. Like that's not acceptable. What you're feeling is valid. That's not you just having a hard time in grad school. That's not okay. Right. So you being that person for a student, you being that listening box. And of course, always doing that with the lens of providing the support and right. We can be empathetic for students and also our colleagues, right? But being there, being present, listening, providing that support for students, I think that can be an integral support for them. It doesn't erase, right? It doesn't ignore all of the experiences that they're having, but it can provide an option or an opportunity for them to have a place to go that can maybe keep them persisting or help them to unpack what's happening and why it might be happening. But yes, at the end of the day, our goal is that everyone comes to this conference, right? Yeah.
So I'm all about what you're talking about. And I had the epiphany a couple of years ago. And so now I've kind of like come to the dark side, and I was on the harsh side, I guess you can say. I completely understand all of this when it relates to students. When you're a faculty member who understands this and you're surrounded by faculty members who do not embrace this, and they're complaining and sharing the war stories, what do you do besides walk away? I mean, I don't know how to change minds, and I'm not on this campus anymore. God bless the bison, but what I know the pause, like I can definitely pause and try to figure out how to reframe what I'm doing in the classroom to maybe turn somebody else. But do you have any other insights into how to get through to faculty that this is so important if you want to retain students, but also they're learning and everything? I mean, I don't need to replay your speech, but how do you get faculty on board with this?
Yeah. So that's a tough question. And I think if we're trying to tell someone that they have to be empathetic, that will resoundingly fail, right? Like if we're like, well, you should just care more. And they're like, I do care. And you're like, well, right. So I think we have to think about the questions that we ask and the way that we respond. And sometimes we won't get there, but sometimes we can say, ask that question, right? Not in a challenging way, but if they just read the syllabus and be like, oh, how long is your syllabus? Right? Or, okay, where is it in your syllabus? Or how would a student know to find that? Or just saying like, right. And I think everyone has to develop their own empathetic responses, but saying like, that sounds like that would be really frustrating. I understand that is frustrating. I wonder, is there a way that you could, present this earlier in the syllabus so that students weren't aggravating you in this way? Don't do it like that. Right, but if there's something, man, I'm tired of you. No, I think asking questions, but right, empathy says, yeah, right. There are times where even this week, right, where I had a moment where I was like, how is this happening? And then I paused and I said, is there something I could have done so that this wasn't happening? Because not only, right, like students often when they come to us are pretty scared of us, right, in a lot of ways, right? And so to come to us and to ask a question, to ask like, I don't need it. I think sometimes at us, we're like, did you ask 3 before me, please? Or did you read the syllabus? But often a lot of times, by the time they've come to us to ask us a question, like they're kind of paralyzed by this situation already, right? Like they're a little bit scared of us. They know that we might be like, not today, right? Or like, yeah, it's on the syllabus, page 3, find it, right? And so I think recognizing too that like so many times we feel like, and that's why I said interrogate what we think student behaviors are, but we're like, come on, really? But we forget that even though we have had 9 students ask that, this is their first time asking us that. And so, but when we're thinking about dealing with our colleagues, I think we can say and even share our own experience, right? Like, yeah, that would be really frustrating. And one of the things that I have to remind myself is though, even though this is the 9th student email that I've received, it's their first email to me. Or yeah, I used to have that experience, but then I figured out that if I created, in fact, there's a really great chapter that was written about creating interactive syllabi, and maybe everyone already does that links to things, but they're like, I had that same problem too, but then I, created links in my syllabus so students could find this thing, right? So then if you can share that or even ask those questions, right? So often, but the wrong way is to be like, if you were just more empathetic or empathy is really important. I think a lot of times faculty know that, right? But there are so many things going on. There are so many emails coming in. It often feels like we're saying the same thing over and over again, that we're responding to everyone, right? When we're forgetting that the individual is a student. But if we're talking about others, asking questions, validating their emotions, because it can feel really frustrating, right? Saying like, yeah, that does sound annoying. I would be frustrated too. Or I remember being frustrated, and then asking, why they think that might be.
Respondent or one of the audience just wants to know if you're willing to share the questions that you asked, the critical questions. About halfway in, you said there was.
Oh, yep. So I absolutely am, but it's not mine. So it's the critical incidence questionnaire, and it's from Brookfield. And I don't remember the exact year, but it's Brookfield's critical incidence questionnaire. Is it 2012? Did I see mouthing? Yeah. I love it. I think it's everything. And I probably don't need to, I can stop share. Is that right, Stacy?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
I appreciate your talk and your attention to care ethics. I was wondering if you could help us distinguish caring about our students versus caring for our students.
That's a good question. Can you say more about like what you see as that distinction, or what the difference would be?
Yeah, and I'm kind of drawing off like Nell Nodding's work. I don't know if you're familiar with her, but I guess to me, like caring about is more kind of like about yourself or your own even power a little bit. Where when you're caring for, it could be like reciprocal, and it usually is like grounded in the student or the students. And anyway, that was very enlightening to me, and I wondered if you had any perspective on that.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you saying that. And so we're diving down into an ethic of care right now, which is interesting. And that the book chapter that I mentioned does go a little bit deeper into that. But one of the important things about care ethics more broadly is that it's reciprocal, right? And so the idea that you are doing things and students respond in some sort of way when we're thinking about that in a teaching framework. And so I would say, and I love your question. I don't know that I've thought about it in this way, but if we're thinking about teaching with empathy, it's still important for us to care about our profession. It's important for us to care about our career. But if we're thinking about teaching empathy and doing that through an ethic of care, recognizing that this is an interactive and reciprocal process where you're learning about them, you're paying attention to them, and then making decisions that demonstrate care and respect for them, not just sort of thinking about yourself. But I want to say there's a caution there too. Being empathetic also involves, and a key component of that is self-empathy or self-compassion. And so it's important that we're making empathetic decisions, that we're demonstrating care for our students, whether that's in the language that we use in the syllabus, but that we're also doing it in a way that demonstrates care and respect for ourselves as well. And I think sometimes that's important too, when we're thinking about how we're making adjustments to our course to maybe support a student who's asking for something else, recognizing too, we want to make the best decision for them, but we also have to make the right decision for the students, for everyone that we're responsible for, including ourselves. And so also respecting the work that we've done in creating a syllabus, but also that if someone leaves our classroom, right, the next class that they take are going to assume that they've learned the things that we said they've learned right in our classroom. And so making that distinction between the two, I think it's maybe less black and white than caring about or caring for or caring with, right? But the idea that all three are important. How do we care about our profession? How do we feel about what it means to be a professor? How does it mean to care about the individual student in our classroom? How does it look to create a caring environment and an empathetic environment? And I would say all three are important. And sometimes we have to start with one before we can build the other. And often starting with one is right, either developing that self-empathy or developing that more micro level empathy with the individual in the room. But yeah, care ethics offers so much to thinking about what it means to teach with empathy. And it just offers a lot in general, but great question. Yeah.
Can you say more about, and I might ask you to go back to a slide, even though I know you stopped sharing, the paying attention bullet number 1, which was kind of getting to know the sociocultural characteristics of your students versus the power differential of asking them to be your cultural informants. I got a little lost there about what's the right way, what's not, how to avoid putting them in a position where they're at a disadvantage, but still being able to learn about them and how their individual experience of their culture informs who they are and all that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that there is a difference between finding out what students want to share about themselves, right? What they want to tell you about who they are. And then for you to say, oh, I don't know a lot about maybe those who identify the way that you do, right? And then sitting down and asking them questions about that. So there's a difference between allowing a student to, you say, tell me about yourself and maybe what's important for you to have me understand as your instructor, and then for you to identify something and saying like, oh, I need to know more about that, and then sitting the student down and making them tell you all about it. There is an array of resources on the internet that can help you learn about different cultures, right? And whether that's like YouTube videos even, or reading blogs, or reading personal stories, or doing actual research, doing that research on your own. But asking students to introduce themselves to you and seeing what they choose to share about you, right? That's you getting to know them. It would turn into perhaps troubling power differential if you were to then make them sit down and do that. And often we can run the risk of assuming that they know all the things about their culture too, right? And so we've tokenized them, and we put them in a power situation where they feel like they can't say no, right? And then, we have to be careful in that balance. So, but I see what you're saying too. And I think it's okay to ask questions. But if we're treating it as like, this is the way that we're going to learn about this culture, like this is our opportunity, right? That's when we need to find that edge. But allowing students to share and disclose, or to pick topics that are related to what they're interested in and their identity, that's giving them the power and autonomy to make those choices. And we should absolutely build that into our classrooms. But if we're wanting to learn about the socio-historical or cultural context that maybe is an area that we don't know about, we should not go to students and rely on them to do that teaching. Does that provide more clarity? Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm glad you asked.
I was wrong. It's 2006 for Brookfield, and it's called The Skillful Teacher, 2nd edition, and it's Jossie Mass.
Thank you. So The Skillful Teacher, 2006.
Mm-hmm.
And if you just Google critical incidents questionnaire in Brookfield, Brookfield, or take one of my classes. Yeah.
One of the justifications for the university going to professional advisors was to create this advisor-student empathy. What's your opinion about professional advisors?
So, wow. Time. No, I'm just kidding. So we are at an institution, and the way that higher education is organized is in a way that those who have the most knowledge and skill in an area, such as counseling or advising, can provide that support to students. And so I will say I'm excited about the opportunity to have people that have all of this knowledge and all of this skill can do the work of helping students to make those decisions. Does that mean that faculty no longer have to be empathetic or no longer have to be involved in those discussions? I don't think anyone would say that that's what's happening here. I think they've just identified an area where we can better support students and then done a thing that we often ask higher education to do, which is like, put some money behind it, right? Put some training behind it. Make sure we have people that are really skilled and qualified in doing that work. So I think that's exciting. And I think if we can remember that we're all sort of in this together, right? And so we now have another tool. We now have another resource on our list that we can ask questions of or refer students to. Or if we make those relationships, that those advisors can then refer them to us, right? And say, and know when and how those relationships or conversations need to happen. We need to be prepared to provide all the support that we can. But often as faculty, advising can feel like a lot, right? And so if we have someone that has the in-depth knowledge of the coursework, and we can really think about the ways that we can support students as they directly relate to our own sort of knowledge base, our own area, even the coursework, I see that as an opportunity for us to better support students. That being said, though, I think everyone, when talking about that, has been very clear that it doesn't mean that we don't get to talk to students about right courses and we don't get to do some of that advising. We've just added another tool to that, to our toolbox, our teaching toolbox. Great question. Now look at the time. Yes.
How do empathy and perspective taking impact or could guide, inform your approach to assessment of student learning? You mentioned an example of how that could look, but are there other ways that you're using that to guide your approach?
Yeah, I think, and this could be in its own presentation, I would say. But the more ways that we can think about assessment in two ways. One is authentic. And so authentic to the way that something will be demonstrated is important. So the more ways that we can think about how are we assessing students in a way that it is the actual way that this knowledge will maybe be retained or assessed or used in the field is important and it's relevant. The second thing that I'll say too, and this can be a little bit harder from an assessment perspective, but it's 100% possible, is to again allow student choice. And so allowing them to have choices in the assignments that they're doing and then building in. And I think if we go back to kind of being prepared to respond, one of the things that's important for students is to know how they're going to be assessed, right? And so having the assessment mechanisms up front, like having a rubric present, right? Explaining how grading is happening, that demonstrates empathy and helps students to know what's happening or what's going to happen in an assignment. The other thing that I think is important too, and that I do in some classes, not all, is the students and I work together for certain assignments to create a rubric. So working with them, asking like, here's the assignment. Y'all have done some work on it already. Let's talk about what we think this should look like. What should this assignment be? What should this look like? And I find that does two things. It talks a lot about student choice. Often too, like I think sometimes I hear from faculty like, oh, students aren't going to be hard enough, or which is always right. We want to interrogate that. But I find the opposite, right? Where students are talking about things and are wanting to be, in some cases, I have to say like, oh, that seems like a lot to require for this assignment. Are we sure we want to go all the way to 19 criteria, right? And so walking them back, right, to make those. I would say, and I would say more than anything else, and this doesn't directly get to your question, but like the more that we can trust students and demonstrate or inform or show students that we trust them is an important way to do that. But right, having that conversation, having them create a rubric, that does two things. It helps them to get buy-in into assignment, right? It helps them to understand what they're going to have to do, but it also tells them like, hey, the other rubrics in this class, they might be important too, right? And so recognizing like, okay, so we're going to do that. And the way that I'll do it often is we'll create the rubric as a class. And then I'll have them do peer review where they use the rubric that they created to assess that work. Can help them to really see. And then I'll be like, yeah, that can really help them to, it like unveils the rest of the process. And so if I were thinking about it from an assessment perspective, where like rubrics are often preset and kind of loaded into a system, right, that students are learning, I need students to understand that that rubric is how it's going to be used. But it's not, even though it's automatic for us to think, oh, there's a rubric, read the rubric, follow the assignment, right? That's not always intuitive to students. We have to walk them through that process. We have to tell them, this is how this works. This is what it looks like. And so maybe having another assignment in the middle of the semester or earlier in the semester where you model to them how you're going to use a rubric, it empowers them. It shows them how grading or maybe assessment is done in the classroom. It familiarizes it with them. They get comfortable with it, but then they also know for that final assignment how they can use the rubric, right? That rubric should empower them. That should help them to know, hey, you meet all of those characteristics, like you're good. You've got this process down. That's a great question. And I think we have time for one more question, or I don't,
Probably one more, and that's, yeah.
one like short one.
You talked about trusting students there. And how do you handle it when that trust is broken? When you find out that you've been empathetic and you've allowed the students to be, or maybe flexible with students, and then that trust is broken. How do you handle that?
Yeah, that can be a hard one. And often it's like at least for me, often that can feel like it's a hit to my ego in some ways. Like, see, I think especially people can be like, see, I tried being empathetic and look what happened. I would say two things. And these have taken me a long time to come to just a place where I accept them. One, I'm not a detective. And so if a student chooses to tell me that something happened, it's not my job to figure out if that really happened, because at the end of the day, I'm motivated by making sure they have demonstrated that they meet the learning objectives. And if they do that in a slightly different way, I've still achieved my goal. What I always remind myself is maybe this time I was wrong, maybe. But what was the risk? What, to me, the greater risk is always, but what if I wasn't empathetic and I should have been? And so I've had to say, like, what's the greater risk here? There's the ego threat, right? Where I was wrong, but I still created a situation where they had to meet the learning objectives. Okay, well, that sucked. But what if I hadn't been, and it had been the reason that a student dropped the class or dropped out of the program or chose not to do those things? And so for me personally, I'm willing to take the risk, right, of being empathetic and being wrong than not being empathetic and finding out later that like had a really negative impact on their career. So it's a good question. Thank you.
Let's all thank Laura.